food, cultures of our backgrounds, and maybe even religious culture. In a different way, religious culture. I'm gonna just challenge all of us to think about culture as it pertains to us as migrants and immigrants and residents of this country. So when we talk about church, we can talk about how there's a universal Catholic church and how we all belong to that, but how we're different but the same. But there is this whole other culture of Catholics who are not attending church, formerly known as Catholics. And that is a huge population even amongst our people. So I think that's a reality, that's an intercultural reality that we have to think about. Practicing active Catholics versus former active Catholics. And then there's the reality of secular people who are not Christian that we deal with. And that comes out in our political realities, right? And it comes out even in our religious realities. Even when people are not active, people like to have a voice in our religion. And there's the reality of the culture clash between lay people and maybe religious, and maybe hierarchy. You know who you are? And us little peons. There is that reality of who has a voice and who doesn't have a voice. There's the LGBTQ issue, which we also don't talk about a lot in the church and in our API communities. That is a reality. And I would say even in the church, there's East Coast Catholics, there's West Coast Catholics, you know what I'm talking about? And that's also intercultural, sometimes conflict, sometimes challenges. We do things differently. And even just like, tall people and short people, these are the realities. So I just throw those out as a challenge for each of us to think about in terms of culture. What does it really mean? How do we identify ourselves as Catholic API, but even within that box, how do you identify in terms of all of these kinds of cultures? And then for us to think about how do we encounter each other, and how do we embrace each other, and how do we experience each other. This is where I go to my Franciscan theology roots. I did my graduate work with the Franciscans. And so here I will bring up a theology of abundance versus a theology of scarcity. And I think this really speaks to a lot of API communities, but maybe just migrant and immigrant communities in particular, because we are trying to not only survive, but we're trying to thrive in a new country. And a lot of that has to do with material wealth and material success and material abundance. And I think sometimes that gets in the way of everything else. And so if we can go back to a theology of abundance, as Jesus has given us an abundant life. We read things in scripture about you don't need to worry about where you're gonna get your food and where you're gonna find community and these kinds of things. If we can really go to that and live our lives with a theology of abundance, I think we can approach each other. And in particular, I would say we can approach intergenerational things as well, because we tend to approach the younger generation as lacking. They don't speak our language. They don't go to church. They don't pray the rosary. And we approach it, whether we know it or not, from that perspective of scarcity and lacking and not enough. So if we can just twist, just turn a little bit, what we call a metanoia, turning of the heart, a conversion to a perspective, a theology of abundance and trust, that the younger generation has a different reality than the older generation. We're very easy to ask younger generations to help us with things like technology, but we're very slow to ask them about the reality of their own faith lives.